As a lifelong Hull City fan, I know a thing or two about humiliating defeats. Here I am, 6 years ago, refusing to let my spirits be dampened, despite the fact that we were getting battered 6-1 away at Bournemouth. In fairness, it was only 5-1 when that photograph was taken, and you have really got to make the most of it when you have already committed to a 10-hour round trip. In the last game of that same season, by which stage we had, unsurprisingly, already been relegated, the mighty Tigers went one better than that, losing 7-1 to Tottenham Hotspur. And during the first COVID lockdown, in what was a real nadir even of the Alam era at the club, we lost 8-0 to Wigan Athletic after conceding 7 first-half goals. Still, it could be worse. Last weekend, Bournemouth suffered a 9-0 thrashing at the hands of Liverpool, tying Southampton's 2 9-0 defeats to Leicester City and Manchester United, and Ipswich Town's 9-0 hammering, also at the hands of Manchester United, as the heaviest defeat of the Premier League era. In light of some high-profile recent humiliations, and a handful of requests from some of you, today we are going to take a look at some of the most embarrassing defeats in the history of every Premier League team. They don't have to be 8 or 9-0 massacres, some might just be by 1 goal but to non-league opposition in a cup competition, and in some cases, it is more of a case of the context that surrounded the game, and what happened during it, that made it so humiliating. Every team in the Premier League is over 100 years old, which meant that this took absolutely ages. But hopefully you will enjoy it, apart from when your team's turn comes, of course. Here is every Premier League team's most humiliating defeat. Arsenal, 8-2 to Manchester United. We start with Arsenal, and I was reluctant to pick the 8-2 defeat to Manchester United, since it just seemed to be too easy and too obvious. But I do feel as though it was more humiliating than even the Gunners' 6-0 defeat to Chelsea in 2014, or their record 7-0 defeat to West Bromwich Albion back in 1922. I can remember vividly going into that game against Manchester United, which was only the 3rd game of the 2011-12 season, a feeling amongst a lot of football fans that Arsenal might be in trouble. They had lost Cesc Fabregas, Gael Clichy, and Samir Nasri over the summer, and they were winless in their opening 2 fixtures, having just lost 2-0 to Liverpool. The game wasn't an immediate disaster for Arsenal, who trailed 3-1 at half-time, but a red card to Carl Jenkinson and a second-half capitulation resulted in a scoreline that would go down in the history books. The humiliation came not just from the scoreline or the performance, but also what it signalled. Arsenal and Manchester United had been the 2 great rivals of the Premier League era, and Alex Ferguson and Arsene Wenger such famous adversaries. The manner of the defeat emphasised the enormous gulf that now existed between the 2 teams, in a way that must have been deeply painful for Arsenal fans. It was the first time that Arsenal had conceded 8 goals since losing 8-0 to Loughborough in 1896, a club that folded 4 years later in another of the Gunners' most embarrassing defeats. Aston Villa, 6-0 to Liverpool. The entire 2015-16 season was just one long humiliation for Aston Villa, as 28 years of consecutive top-flight football at Villa Park was brought to a shattering halt in one of the worst campaigns of the Premier League era. Villa lost 4-0 to Everton, Man City, Chelsea and Arsenal that season, as well as getting turned over by rivals West Bromwich Albion, but their most humiliating defeat of all came at the hands of Liverpool. Not only did Liverpool stick 6 goals past Villa without breaking a sweat, to begin a run of 11 straight defeats for the club, Emre Can, Nathaniel Klein and Kolo Toure all got themselves on the scoresheet. And after the game, Jolyon Lescott delighted the Villa fans by tweeting a photo of a luxury Mercedes in a moment that went down in Premier League folklore. Honourable mentions go to Villa's 8-0 and 7-1 defeats to Chelsea, which came just 2 years apart, and their 2-1 defeat to non-league Millwall Athletic all the way back in the year 1900. Bournemouth, 5-0 to Morecambe. Bournemouth might just have lost 9-0 to a rebounding Liverpool team in their heaviest ever defeat, but that is far from the South Coast club's most humiliating defeat. Back in December 2009, during Eddie Howe's first stint at the club, Bournemouth were second in League 2, battling to win promotion back up to League 1. They faced a Morecambe side in fine form though, and a first half Marvin Bartley red card, with the Cherries already losing 3-0, ensured that it would be a very long trip home to Dorset. More recently, Bournemouth have suffered humiliating 6-0 defeats to both Norwich City and Brentford, and that 9-0 to Liverpool, as a record-equalling Premier League era defeat surely deserves an honourable mention, even if getting battered by Liverpool, rather than Morecambe, is a testament to how far Bournemouth have come over the past decade. Brentford, 7-0 to Peterborough United. Speaking of Brentford, who slapped Bournemouth for 6 back in 2011, they too are a club who have been on a real journey in an upwards trajectory over the last 10 to 15 years. The Bees' most brutal defeat, in my eyes, came in November 2007 during a season in which Brentford flirted with relegation to the non-league. The low light was no doubt a 7-0 defeat away at Peterborough United, in which goalkeeper Simon Brown was sent off and gave away a penalty in the first minute, and Aaron McLean was all too happy to score a hat-trick. Brentford avoided relegation that season, whilst Peterborough won promotion, but Matthew Benham would soon step up his involvement in running and financing the Bees, beginning their charge up through the divisions. Brighton and Hove Albion, 1-0 to Walsall. Breaking the mould from the 4 drubbings that have got us started, Brighton only lost 1-0 to Walsall in September 2008, but it was the manner of that defeat that made it the Seagulls' most humiliating of all time. Brighton put in some comical performances during their mostly rather miserable 12-year stay at the Withdean Stadium, but when Walsall were reduced to 10 men within the opening 15 minutes, they must have fancied their chances. In the 33rd minute, a second sending off meant that Walsall would have to play more than an hour of football with just 9 men. Yet, somehow, Brighton not only failed to score, but actually managed to lose the game 1-0. There have since been 6-0 defeats to West Ham United, and that 5-0 defeat to Bournemouth that cost Chris Hughton his job, but the Walsall game sticks out as being the most embarrassing, narrowly ahead of famous FA Cup first-round defeats to Kingstonian and Walton and Hersham in 1994 and 1973 respectively. Chelsea, 7-0 to Leeds United. There was little to split newly formed rivals Chelsea and Leeds United in 1967. Just 5 points and 2 league places would separate them come the end of the 1967-68 season, and in their 3 previous encounters that year, 2 in the league and 1 in the cup, Chelsea had won 1, Leeds had won 1, and the other ended all square. But manager Tommy Docherty had just resigned when Chelsea travelled to Elland Road, and 7 separate goal scorers, including a Marvin Hinton own goal, sentenced the Blues to their joint heaviest defeat of all time. The other 2 came against Wolverhampton Wanderers and Nottingham Forest, meanwhile 6-0 defeats to Manchester City and West London rivals Queen's Park Rangers, and also a 4-2 FA Cup giant killing at the hands of Bradford City, all deserve very honourable mentions. But the fact that there was so little to split Chelsea and Leeds at the time, the bad blood between them, and the 7-goal margin of defeat all combine to make it the club's most embarrassing loss in my book. Crystal Palace, 1-0 to Hartlepool United. Crystal Palace have lost 9-0 and 7-0 to Liverpool alone in 1989 and 2020, and the Eagles even got battered 7-2 by Mansfield Town in 1962. So why on earth would I pick a game in which they only lost 1-0 as their most humiliating defeat? Well, allow me to set the scene if you will. Palace travelled to the Victoria Ground in January 1993 as Premier League opposition, who had won their last 6 games on the bounce. Hartlepool, meanwhile, were in the old Division 2 at the time, which was the new name for English football's 3rd tier, following the creation of the Premier League. It was from a penalty that should never have been awarded that Hartlepool won the game, but that hardly eased the pain for Palace fans. And the club went on, after that humiliating defeat, to win just 5 more games in the league all season, finishing bottom of the Premier League and suffering relegation. Everton, 5-1 to Dinamo Bucharest. I was really torn when it came to Everton, who lost 2-1 to Shrewsbury Town in an incredibly embarrassing FA Cup defeat in 2003, and were battered 5-0 at home by Merseyside rivals Liverpool in 1982, shortly before they would overtake the Reds as the dominant force not just on Merseyside, but in all of English football. The 5-1 defeat to Dinama Bucharest in 2005 was particularly brutal though, given the context of that result. Everton finished above Liverpool, and in the top four, for the first time since the late 1980s in the 2004-05 season. But Liverpool would still manage to qualify for the Champions League after they won the competition following an extraordinary comeback in the final against AC Milan. That was contrasted with Everton's torrid 2005-06 European campaign, in which the Toffees lost both legs to Villarreal in qualifying, meaning that they failed to qualify for the Champions League group stage and instead dropped down into the first round of the UEFA Cup. That was where they met Romanian opposition in the form of Dinama Bucharest, who battered Everton 5-1 in the first leg and eventually 5-2 on aggregate. Everton haven't finished in the top four since. Fulham, 6-0 to Hull City. Have I included this partly because it was my own team that inflicted the humiliating defeat? Yes. Was it still incredibly embarrassing for Fulham? Also yes. Hull City don't tend to win many games in the Premier League, let alone win them by 6 goals. To make this game in December 2013 all the more extraordinary though, the scoreline was tied at 0-0 at half-time. Whatever René Meulenstein must have said to his players during the break was not particularly helpful, it would seem, as 6 second-half goals sent Hull up into the top half and Fulham down into the bottom 3. This was also the game that saw Tom Huddleston finally shave his hair, having promised not to do so until he scored his next goal over 2.5 years earlier. Honourable mentions, or dishonourable in this context I suppose, go to Fulham's 10-0 defeat to Liverpool in a League Cup second-round first-leg fixture, which did make the second leg a little bit redundant, and the Cottagers' 9-0 defeat to Wolverhampton Wanderers all the way back in 1959. Leeds United, 1-0 to Histon. The early to mid-2000s were a rough period for Leeds United, who wildly overspent in the Premier League before being hit with a massive points deduction and suffering 2 relegations. There were many dreadful defeats throughout that particular era, but none more humiliating than the humbling that Leeds received at the hands of non-league Histon, a village club from Cambridgeshire who have never reached the Football League. Histon's 1-0 win signified the extent to which Leeds had fallen, as if anyone needed reminding. I must also give a special mention to the 6-0 defeat the Leeds suffered against Yorkshire rival Sheffield Wednesday, once back in the Championship, in 2014, and also the 3-2 defeat to Colchester United back in 1971, at a time when Leeds were one of the best teams in England and Colchester were in the bottom division, which represented one of the greatest FA Cup upsets of all time. Leicester City, 1-0 to Harlow Town. Making its successive 1-0 FA Cup humiliations against non-league minnows, Leicester City's 1-0 defeat to Harlow Town in 1980 was, by almost any measure, even worse than Leeds United's defeat to Histon. Harlow Town played in the Isthmian League Premier Division at the time, the 7th tier of English football. Meanwhile, Leicester City were top of the 2nd Division and would win promotion that season, with a young Gary Lineker leading their line. Lineker, who was suffering from tonsillitis on the day of the game, could do nothing to prevent Harlow from winning 1-0 at Filbert Street in what was a third-round replay, with the two teams already having drawn 0-0 in Essex, which would have been embarrassing enough for the Foxes. Leicester City's 12-0 and 4-1 defeats to Nottingham Forest were also pretty humiliating, it would be fair to say, as was the club's 6-1 defeat to Tottenham. Oh, and who could forget their playoff semi-final defeat to Watford, in which Anthony Knockaert failed to convert his penalty before Watford went straight up the other end and scored. Liverpool, 6-1 to Stoke City. A bit like with our first inclusion, this seemed too obvious, but I still think that it might be right. Losing 6-1 to Stoke City would be incredibly humiliating for Liverpool at any time, but to do it in the final game of the 2014-15 season, in what was Steven Gerrard's last game for the club, that made it at least 10 times worse. Having only narrowly missed out on the Premier League title to Manchester City the previous season, Liverpool were battered and bruised by the Potters, as two former Reds in Charlie Adam and Peter Crouch both found the back of the net. Meanwhile, former Manchester United trainee Mambiram Diouf bagged a brace. I was spoilt for choice in terms of Liverpool, in fairness, as despite being one of the most storied and successful clubs in all of world football, they are not short of humiliations. A 5-1 defeat to Coventry City, a 2-1 defeat to Blackpool, and infamous losses in the FA Cup to the likes of Northampton Town and Worcester also made my shortlist, but just missed out. Manchester City, 1-0 to Bury. A 5-0 trouncing at the hands of Manchester United in 1994, when Eric Cantona put on a masterclass, and that 8-1 defeat to Middlesbrough shortly before the arrival of Sheikh Mansour will both live long in the memory for Manchester City fans, for all of the wrong reasons. But three of the club's most humiliating defeats, to Bury, Stockport County, and Crewe Alexandra, all came during the 1997-98 campaign. That was a season that saw Man City suffer a second relegation in only 3 years, dropping down into the third tier for the very first time. And it was pretty humiliating from start to finish. It is the Bury game that I have picked out on Valentine's Day 1998 as probably the lowest point in the entire history of the club. Just 10 miles separates the two clubs, and a crowd of almost 30,000 turned out to witness a result that was never supposed to happen at Main Road. The citizens have never actually played Bury since that match, and whilst Manchester City are now the richest club in world football and the dominant force within the English game, Bury entered administration and were expelled from the Football League in 2019. Manchester United, 6-1 to Manchester City. I managed to avoid including a Manchester derby once, but I'm afraid that I cannot pull it off twice. Like Liverpool, the sheer size of Manchester United as a football club almost dictates that they have been on the receiving end of several high-profile giant killings, such as their 2-1 defeat to Athletic Bournemouth, as well as famously losing 5-0 to Newcastle United in 1996 and to Chelsea in 1999 in the league. The 6-1 thrashing, at home no less, to Man City in 2011 was surely the most stunning and humiliating defeat of the lot. This was not the Manchester United of Tommy Docherty or David Moyes. This was the Manchester United of Alex Ferguson, up against the club that he had disparagingly described as being United's noisy neighbours. They were certainly noisy that day at Old Trafford, as Mario Balotelli and Edin Dzeko both bagged braces, meanwhile Johnny Evans saw red. 3 of Manchester City's goals came either in or after the 90th minute, turning a bad result into arguably the worst in the history of the club. Newcastle United, 4-0 to Southend United. I could have gone with another Derby Day despair, most notably in the case of Newcastle, their 2-0 defeat to Sunderland in the 1990 playoff semi-final, but whilst that might just have been the club's most painful defeat, I don't think that it was their most humiliating. I have given that title to the 4-0 defeat that Newcastle suffered at Roots Hall on New Year's Day 1992, narrowly ahead of the Magpies Cup upsets against Hereford, Stevenage, and most recently, Cambridge United. What made Newcastle's 1992 defeat to Southend United all the more humiliating, in fact, was the fact that it wasn't perceived as being either an enormous upset nor a giant killing. Newcastle had been relegated to the second division in 1989, and they were mired in a relegation scrap once again, this time threatened with relegation to the third tier in the 1991-92 season. Southend put Newcastle to the sword, with Brett Angle bagging a brace shortly before his disastrous move to Everton. Nottingham Forest, 5-2 to Yeovil Town. Few clubs have seen more extreme highs and lows than Nottingham Forest, from 2-time European champions to getting thrashed by the likes of Scunthorpe United and Yeovil Town. Until last season, Forest had a truly diabolical record in the playoffs, but in the 2006-07 season, The Trees beat Yeovil Town 2-0 away from home in the League One playoff semi-final first leg. So far, so good. Unfortunately, in the second leg, Forest utterly capitulated at the City ground, losing 5-2 to Yeovil, who had 5 different goal scorers, which included an Alan Wright own goal, and therefore they lost 5-4 in aggregate. There were plenty of candidates for Forest, admittedly, which included that 3-0 defeat to Derby County in 2016, in which Nicholas Bentner scored an own goal, but I think that the Yeovil defeat just about takes the biscuit. Southampton, 9-0 to Manchester United. I have, up to this point, largely avoided just picking a team's heaviest or most famous defeat, because that is not the primary criteria, and rarely is a team's most humiliating defeat actually their heaviest defeat. You could even argue, in the case of Southampton, that surely losing 9-0 at home to Leicester City is more humiliating than losing 9-0 away at Manchester United. In isolation, I would tend to agree. But the reason Southampton's 9-0 defeat to Manchester United is, I think, the most humiliating defeat in the history of the club is purely because of the fact that it was their second 9-0 defeat in successive seasons. Only one other team, prior to Bournemouth's recent hammering at Anfield, had lost by that margin during the Premier League era, yet the Saints managed to do it twice in the space of 15 months, which, I think you'd have to agree, is quite funny and quite humiliating. Tottenham Hotspur, 2-1 to West Ham United. I know what you're probably thinking. West Ham aren't that bad, and 2-1 isn't a particularly emphatic defeat, and you would be quite right. However, as most Spurs fans watching this will probably know, I am not just referring to any old 2-1 defeat to West Ham. Tottenham have had more typically embarrassing defeats, like losing 5-1 to Newcastle United, 3-0 multiple times to their North London rivals Arsenal, 7-2 to Bayern Munich, and a defeat on penalties to Colchester United in the League Cup just a few years ago. But Tottenham's 2-1 defeat to West Ham was the now infamous match which surrounded the scandal known as Lasagna Gate. Spurs were in pole position at the time to finish in the top 4 for the first time during the Premier League era under Martin Jol, and just needed to match Arsenal's result on the final day of the season to realise that achievement. Unfortunately, most of their squad came down with food poisoning before the game against West Ham, and Spurs lost 2-1. Meanwhile, Arsenal beat Wigan Athletic 4-2 to steal in ahead of them. Everything about that West Ham game, the anticipation, capitulation, and unusual backstory surrounding it, leading not just to Tottenham missing out on the top 4, but also to Arsenal taking their place, was just ultimate Spursy and ultimate humiliation. Hence why it features ahead of Tottenham's more conventional embarrassing defeats. West Ham United, 6-0 to Reading. From a famous West Ham win to an infamous defeat, I was, once again, spoilt for choice with this one. I very nearly went with the Hammers' 5-2 defeat to Barnsley in the League Cup in 1987, or the club's famous 8-2 defeat at home to Blackburn Rovers in the First Division on Boxing Day 1963, but I think that the Reading game was, on the balance of things, more humiliating than both. It was New Year's Day 2007, and Alan Kirbishley had only recently taken over from Alan Pardew. West Ham were winless in their last 3, but newly promoted Reading were winless in 6, so the Hammers were eyeing up a major opportunity to pick up 3 points. Not only would they not get 3 points, they were utterly torn apart by Reading, who, as is becoming a bit of a recurring theme in this video, had 6 different goal scorers, including 1 own goal, this time by Anton Ferdinand. West Ham survived that season, controversially, thanks to Carlos Tevez. Meanwhile, Reading finished 8th, but were relegated the following season. Wolverhampton Wanderers, 3-0 to Peterborough United. It was a toss-up with Wolves between their 3-0 defeat to Peterborough, their 5-1 thrashing by rivals West Brom, and their 3-0 trouncing by non-league Chorley in the FA Cup. But ultimately, I think the Peterborough game was Wolves' lowest ebb. Relegated from the Premier League in the 2011-12 season, Wolves were just 6 points off the playoffs, on Boxing Day 2012. Meanwhile, Peterborough were rooted to the foot of the table. Peterborough rode the early storm though, before sucker punching Wolves twice, adding a third, and then comfortably seeing out the rest of the game. It was the start of a 12-game winless run for Wolves, who finished the season in 23rd and were relegated, along with Peterborough, to League One. So that is it for today's video, but thank you all as ever for watching. I thoroughly hope that you enjoyed it. Hit the like button if that was the case, it is completely free of charge. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure, of course, that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. It would be humiliating for all of you if that wasn't the case. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.